The poisonous rattlesnake left in Paul Morantz's mailbox on October 10, 1978, was not merely an attack targeting a lawyer. It was a turning point that exposed the darkest side of Synanon, an organization that had been presented to the public for years as a successful rehabilitation center. In the previous episode, we examined how Synanon gradually transformed into an increasingly authoritarian structure. The culture of loyalty within the organization, the threats directed at dissenters, and ultimately the infamous Rattlesnake attack on Paul Morantz. But the real question is this: what happened after the attack? This incident, which nearly resulted in the death of a lawyer, drew the attention of police and prosecutors to Synanon. Before long, investigations began, raids were carried out, and significant evidence regarding the inner workings of the organization, which had operated behind closed doors for years, started to emerge. As the investigation progressed, not only those who carried out the attack but also Synanon high-ranking leaders would come under scrutiny. In this episode, we will examine how the Rattlesnake attack was uncovered, what evidence was seized during police raids, and how the investigation reached the very heart of Synanon. We will then take a closer look at what Chuck Dederich said in recorded conversations, the lawsuits that followed, the sentences that were handed down, and the tax investigations that shook the organization's financial structure. Once regarded as one of America's most successful rehabilitation movements, Synanon was now making headlines for a very different reason. Having lost its reputation, the organization would be forced to confront mounting lawsuits, financial crisis, and growing public pressure. But how did this process affect Chuck Dederich? How did Synanon come to an end? And how did this organization, which had grown for decades, ultimately fall apart? In this episode, we will follow Synanon's collapse step by step, because Morantz had long been filing lawsuits against Synanon and representing former members of the organization. Investigators began to focus on the possibility that the attack was connected to the group. The threats Morantz had received in recent years suddenly became highly relevant. A significant number of these threats had come from individuals associated with Synanon. The method of the attack also attracted attention. Placing a live rattlesnake in someone's mailbox required planning, obtaining the snake, and knowledge of the target's daily routines. As a result, police increasingly came to the conclusion that the incident was a premeditated and organized attack. As the investigation progressed, several Synanon members emerged as suspects. Phone records, witness statements, and information coming from within the organization changed the direction of the investigation. Authorities began to suspect that the attack may not have been the result of a few individuals acting on their own. The objective was no longer merely to identify the attackers, but also to determine whether a chain of command existed behind the attack. One of the most critical phases of the investigation involved raids on Synanon facilities. Authorities conducted searches at various properties. During these raids, they seized numerous firearms, ammunition, corporate documents, internal correspondence, and audio recordings. The audio recordings, in particular, would alter the course of the investigation. They appeared to show that Chuck Dederich used extremely harsh language toward his critics and, at times, made statements that could be interpreted as threats. At first, the Rattlesnake attack was viewed as a single criminal case. However, after the race, federal and state authorities began examining Synanon as a whole. The question was no longer simply, who attacked Paul Morantz? Instead, attention shifted to a much broader question. What else had Synanon been doing behind the scenes for years? From that point forward, investigators began separately examining financial records, tax practices, security teams, leadership decisions, and internal disciplinary methods. According to many investigators, Synanon's downfall was not caused by the Rattlesnake attack itself, but by the far-reaching investigations that followed in its wake. For the first time, government agencies had gained such deep access to the organization's internal structure. It would not be an exaggeration to say that the most important evidence seized was the collection of audio recordings. These recordings led investigators to believe that Synanon was more than just the individuals who carried out the attack. They revealed how the organization's highest-ranking leaders spoke about his opponents. One important point should be noted. Investigators and prosecutors were never able to prove that Dederich explicitly ordered, attacked Paul Morantz with a snake. However, the recordings became central to allegations that he encouraged violence against critics, or at the very least created an environment in which such violence could occur. In the late 1970s, some of Dederic's meetings were being recorded. During these conversations, lawyers, journalists, and former members who had taken action against Synanon were frequently described as enemies. In one particularly notable recording, Dederich made the following statement while discussing lawyers working against Synanon: "I'm quite willing to break some lawyers' legs." This statement would later be cited repeatedly in court proceedings and media reports. According to investigative files and contemporary news reports, some of Dederic's speeches targeted not only lawyers but also their families. What caught prosecutors' attention was that these remarks seemed less like the product of a momentary outburst and more like a reflection of Synanon's increasingly aggressive culture. Dederich no longer viewed critics as people with differing opinions. Instead, he saw them as enemies of the organization. As a result, his language gradually became more combative and threatening. Following the Rattlesnake attack, investigators sought to answer a key question. Did the perpetrators act on their own, or were they encouraged by the organization's leadership? The audio recordings became crucial at this point. They showed that Dederich had long used hostile language towards dissenters, claimed that Synanon was at war, and advocated taking harsh measures against critics. Although they did not establish a direct connection, the recording helped create an indirect link between the attack and the organization's leadership. The release of these recordings caused enormous damage to Synanon's reputation. For years, Synanon had been known as an organization that helped drug addicts. Now, its leader was appearing in newspapers as a figure who made threatening statements, justified violence, and viewed opponents as enemies. This severely damaged the organization's public image. Dederich later argued that some of his statements had been metaphorical and should not have been taken literally. His supporters similarly claimed that the remarks were simply angry words spoken in moments of frustration. Prosecutors disagreed. These statements came to the light after a real attack had been carried out against Paul Morantz. As a result, the recordings were no longer viewed merely as harsh rhetoric, but as potential evidence of a culture of violence. According to many researchers, these recordings were among the most significant pieces of evidence exposing Synanon's inner world to the public. For the first time, people could hear how Chuck Dederich spoke during closed-door meetings. What they heard did not align with the public image of a rehabilitation leader. These recordings would play an important role in the legal cases and investigations that followed, ultimately contributing to Dederich being held legally accountable as well. In 1980, Chuck Dederich chose to reach a plea agreement with prosecutors rather than face a lengthy and risky trial. As part of that agreement, he pleaded guilty to certain charges. This development was extremely significant. For the first time, Synanon's founder and undisputed leader was accepting legal responsibility for acts of violence connected to the organization. Dederich, once regarded as one of America's most respected rehabilitation leaders, was now being described as a convicted criminal. Several members who were found to have been directly involved in the Rattlesnake attack were also convicted on various charges. Among them were those who helped plan the attack, those who provided logistical support, and those who participated in the operation. The sentences varied according to each individual's role. However, the outcome of the trials reinforced the belief that Synanon could not simply be explained as the actions of a few rude members. The Rattlesnake attack case was not the only legal problem facing Synanon. The legal pressure had become overwhelming. During this period, lawsuits filed by former members, compensation claims, complaints from families, and financial investigations also began to increase. While the organization was dealing with criminal cases on one hand, it was also facing civil lawsuits that created substantial financial burdens on the other. According to many researchers, 1980 can be seen as the year Synanon effectively began to lose, because by that point, its leadership was under legal pressure. Public support was rapidly declining. Donors were distancing themselves, and government agencies were closely monitoring the organization. For the first time, the structure that had appeared strong to the outside world for years was forced into a serious defensive position, and an even greater threat was approaching: financial investigations. Because Synanon was being scrutinized not only for incidents of violence, but also for the tax advantages and financial practice it had enjoyed for years. Government agencies were now asking a fundamental question: was Synanon truly a charitable organization, or had it become a closed organization that was abusing tax benefits? By the mid-1970s, Synanon was far more than a small rehabilitation center. The organization owned numerous properties, controlled large tracts of land, generated income through various commercial activities, and had thousands of supporters and donors. Through years of donations and tax advantages, it had built an economic structure worth millions of dollars. At the center of this financial power was one crucial factor: tax-exempt status. In the United States, charities and organizations serving the public interest can benefit from certain tax advantages. For many years, Synanon presented itself as a drug rehabilitation center, an educational institution, and a community service organization. However, by the late 1970s, federal authorities had begun asking a different question: is Synanon still a rehabilitation institution, or has it transformed into a closed cult-like organization? This question was critical, because if the organization was no longer serving the public good, it might no longer qualify for tax-exempt status. The Internal Revenue Service (IRS) began taking a closer look at Synanon financial activities. Authorities were particularly interested in how donations were used, assets accrued from members, commercial income, organizational expenditures, and the financial privileges enjoyed by leadership. The negative publicity generated by the Rattlesnake attack also brought greater attention to these investigations. As the inquiries progressed, it became increasingly difficult for Synanon to maintain its charitable status. Eventually, the organization's tax benefits were severely restricted, and many of the protections associated with its tax-exempt status were removed. This development was devastating for Synanon. For years, its economic model had depended heavily on that status. The organization now faced greater tax burdens, increased financial oversight, and expanded legal liabilities. At the same time, Synanon was confronting another challenge: lawsuits filed by former members, families, and various alleged victims continued to grow in number. These cases meant high legal expenses, compensation payments, and lengthy court proceedings. Financial resources that had once fueled growth were no longer sufficient to keep the organization afloat. One of the most important causes of Synanon's financial decline was the loss of trust. Many individuals and organizations that had donated to Synanon for years began withdrawing their support following reports of violence, the Rattlesnake attack, court proceedings, and media investigations. The organization, once viewed as a rehabilitation movement, was increasingly being described by the public as a cult. As a result, new donations declined. Throughout the 1980s, Synanon's economic strength continued to weaken. The organization began selling off some of its properties, scaling back operations, and losing both staff and members. The large facilities that had once symbolized growth had become financial liabilities. By the mid-1980s, Synanon was a shadow of its former self. Years of investigations, lawsuits, tax problems, reputational damage, and leadership criticisms had eroded the organization's foundations. What had once been one of America's most influential rehabilitation movements was now struggling merely to survive. And during this period, attention once again turned to the organization's founder, Charles Chuck Dederich. As the structure he had ruled with absolute authority for years crumbled, he too was entering the final stage of his life. During the 1980s, Dederich had gradually begun to deteriorate. He had spent many years smoking heavily and consuming large amounts of alcohol. Combined with the effects of aging, he began experiencing a variety of health problems. During this period, his day-to-day control over the organization also declined. Synanon was already shrinking and losing influence. As a result, Dederich's leadership was no longer as powerful as it had once been. Public perception of Dederich during the final years of his life was highly complex. Some still viewed him as a pioneer in the fight against addiction, someone who developed innovative ideas and changed many lives. His critics, however, saw him as an authoritarian leader, a creator of a personality cult, and a figure who fostered an environment of pressure and violence. For that reason, debate about his legacy continued until his death. By the late 1980s, very little remained of Synanon's former power. Membership had declined. Financial resources were being exhausted. Lawsuits continued, and public support had largely disappeared. During this period, Dederich was unable to regain the influence he had enjoyed during Synanon's early years. The leader, who had once influenced thousands of people, now found himself at the head of a steadily shrinking organization. Charles Dederich died in 1998 at the age of 83. His death occurred years after Synanon had effectively ceased to exist. By the end of his life, he was no longer a major figure in the national spotlight. Yet the legacy he left behind remained controversial, because the story of Synanon could be interpreted in two very different ways. On one hand, it was an experiment that challenged conventional approaches to treating drug addiction. On the other, it was an organization that gradually became authoritarian, exercised excessive control over its members, and ultimately became associated with acts of violence. This dual legacy continued to be debated by historians, journalists, and former members long after Dederich's death. In fact, even before its founder died, Synanon had already effectively disintegrated, lost its properties, and ceased to exist as an institution. By the end of the 1980s, Synanon was no longer functioning as an organization in the traditional sense. Its core activities had largely come to a halt. The movement that had begun as a rehabilitation program no longer possessed either its former social influence or its economic power. Eventually, the organization's remaining institutional structure was also dismantled. In 1991, the remaining corporate structure of Synanon was officially dissolved. This date is generally regarded as the organization's official year of dissolution. After existing for more than 3 decades, the organization passed into history both legally and institutionally. A movement that had once been praised by politicians, highlighted by the media, and influenced thousands of people would now survive only in history books and the memories of former members. Although Synanon's physical existence came to an end, its effects did not disappear. former members of the organization, children who grew up within the cult, people who had been separated from their families, former followers who said they had been subjected to years of psychological pressure, all continued their lives carrying different stories. For this reason, many researchers argue that Synanon's true legacy can be seen not in its buildings or properties, but in the people it left behind. By 1991, Synanon had officially come to an end. Its founder had fallen from grace, its financial resources had been exhausted, its members had dispersed, and the structure that had once appeared powerful had become history. Yet the end of an organization does not necessarily mean the end of its influence. There were still important questions left unanswered. What happened to those who managed to leave Synanon? How were the lives of children who grew up inside the cult shaped? Why did the media and public opinion come to view Synanon so differently over the years? And perhaps most importantly, what does the story of Synanon teach us today? In the final episode of our documentary, we will examine Synanon's victims, survivors, and the legacy that continues into the present day. Because some stories continue to live on long after the organizations behind them have disappeared. To watch the final episode as soon as it is released, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. See you next week. Goodbye.